Homosexuality was illegal. There was a lot of, well, not even discrimination. There was just a lot of ignorance that it existed. It was a group of people that were easy to persecute. And so the raids on the bars were just a way for the police to continue to put in their influence in the community, to hold one group of people down. There was a lot of crime and corruption with bar owners, and ties a lot with the mafia in the time, and organized crime. So all of that kind of came together. It was really kind of a seedy part of our past. And that's when the raids on the bars happened. Nobody did anything about it back then. It was just part of life growing up if you were gay or lesbian or bisexual. Not much of a concept of transgender. So for the first part of this, I'm not going to say transgender too much, just because that's not part of what was going on in the consciousness at the time. This went on actually for 2 decades. Actually a little more than that. It was 1924 before the first gay rights organization was formed. So for almost a quarter of a century, these raids happened. Stings, people being arrested, and of course back then if you were arrested, you lost your job, you'd have to move from town, you lost your family if you had it. It often ended up with suicide if someone was picked up in one of these raids. And this went on completely unchallenged for nearly a quarter of a century before the Society for Human Rights first formed. Now, unfortunately, the police began to target this new human rights organization, and they only lasted a few months before, again, they were driven completely out. And the raids went on, and nobody did anything about it until 1947, when there was finally an LGBT publication called Vice Versa. And they weren't necessarily a big political magazine, but it was beginning to chronicle the lives of gay and lesbian people, drag queens. So the concept of some bit of gender variance was beginning to seep into it as well. And then it wasn't for another 4 years, in 1951, that the first major gay rights organization was actually formed in this country, the Mattachine Society. And this organization began to stick, and they began to form chapters around the country to specifically look at a lot of the issues that, frankly, we still work on today. People not being fired from their jobs, people not losing their housing, some basic protections, some basic human dignity. In 1955, the first lesbian rights organization formed, the Daughters of Paulinus, to specifically draw attention to gay women, to lesbians. So it took us half a century just to get culture in magazines and some political groups that weren't immediately forced to abandon their mission out of police persecution. This all began to snowball then pretty quickly. And in the 50s, since we had chronicles of our culture and the beginning of a political movement, by 1957 there was beginning to be research on the psychology of homosexuality. And for the first time, there were studies being released that showed that gay men were just as well adjusted as straight men. Remember, not only was homosexuality a crime for all of this period of time, but as the field of psychology began to grow and began to gain acceptance, homosexuality was considered a disease, a horrible mental health disease. So folks were dealing with this stigma of being diseased. Yet, as they began to organize in groups and began to create culture and learn about each other's lives, realized that gay men and lesbians came in all different stripes and fashions. And that, yeah, some people had mental health issues, but when you're this stigmatized by society, of course you're going to have some mental health issues. Was it the homosexuality or was it the stigma that created those issues? By 1966, the growing research was really beginning to indicate that gay men and lesbians did not have mental health issues. It was not a mental health issue. And in fact, homosexuality was not a reason that people should lose their jobs or lose their housing. And by 1966, the Mattachine Society finally, 66 years after the first bar raids, staged the first protest against bar raids in 1966. They called it a sip-in. It was at Julius's Bar in New York City. And it was to specifically challenge the New York State Liquor Authority prohibition on serving alcohol to gay people. Because it was a crime to serve us a beer. And it took 66 years for us to progress to the point that we felt that we had a right to have a beer. In 1967, the next year, these, what were called the gay rights movement, still trying to figure out who and what we were, and just, you know, for folks that sometimes get frustrated that we're the LGBTQI community, and the letters keep getting added on. We have a very long history and tradition of constantly changing our names. So in 1967, the National Conference of Homophile Organizations was formed. So the first chance to really try to organize on a national basis, bringing together the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, the other smaller groups that were beginning to form in states around the country, was in 1967. And then, of course, we all know that on June 27th in 1969, at the raid at the Stonewall Inn, that was the first time that people really fought back. And again, the neighbors came. And again, it was the transgender community, it was the drag queens, it was the leather bar boys, it was the dykes, it was the gay men, the lesbians, it was the artists, but it was also a lot of their friends and neighbors that for 3 days had these riots in New York City. So again, it's important to understand, part of what makes it a big deal is that for the first time there were other communities coming to the defense of LGBT folks that were being persecuted. Throughout the 70s and 80s, it really sped up very, very quickly. By 1970, we started having pride celebrations around the country to commemorate Stonewall, including here in Atlanta. So it started in the major cities very, very quickly. In 1972 was the first time that LGBT organizers tried to get the Democratic Party platform to support LGBT rights. So suddenly LGBT politics and activism, even though they were not successful in '72, were starting to go very mainstream. 1973, the American Psychological Association finally votes to take away homosexuality as a mental disease. It no longer is considered a mental health issue. 1977, Harvey Milk elected as the first, although there's some dispute that there was perhaps a lesbian that had been elected somewhere a year or two earlier. Harvey Milk is really kind of credited as being the first openly gay elected political figure out in San Francisco. In 1980, the Democratic Party did finally decide to include LGBT rights in their party platform. So it only took 8 years at that point, from the first try to get it in to the time that it finally stuck in 1980. Of course, AIDS came in 1981 and started to have a devastating impact on the LGBT community. But it also gave rise to a new form of activism and advocacy, new opportunities and urgency for people to come out, because you needed doctors, lawyers, attorneys, people had to come out so that their families would know how to take care of them when they were getting sick. It became a matter, certainly, of life and death in a way that had been more urgent than ever before. In 1982, the first statewide gay rights law passed in Wisconsin. So suddenly there was this desire to begin to implement laws that protect LGBT folks. In 1986, the Supreme Court decision Bowers versus Hardwick was held. Now this is an important setback to the gay rights movement because Bowers versus Hardwick, that's actually a case that started here from Georgia. Georgia has a lot of important role in our national gay and lesbian history. Michael Bowers was the Attorney General for the state of Georgia, and Michael Hardwick was a gay man that had been arrested for having consensual sex. In Georgia, we had a sodomy law that it was actually a felony, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. Made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1986, the U.S. Supreme Court said states have the right to regulate sexual activity if they wish to, and they upheld the Georgia state law, which, like I said, was a real setback. In 1992, the U.S. Supreme Court began to reverse itself a little bit by looking at Amendment 2 in Colorado. And finally, and that was an amendment that said there could be no legal protections for the LGBT community. And the U.S. Supreme Court actually overturned that, saying that yes, if a state or a municipality passed a gay rights ordinance, that ordinance could, in fact, be legitimate and be enforced. In 1996, the U.S. Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which we're starting to hear a lot about these days as there are more marriage rights around the country. What DOMA does is that it actually makes it illegal for the federal government to recognize gay marriages, no matter how they're passed or whether they're legal and recognized in any specific state. The federal government cannot recognize it. It also says that other states don't have to recognize it. So there's going to be a lot of challenges to DOMA that you'll be hearing about in the coming years. In 2000, Vermont became the first state to issue civil unions. And in 2003, Lawrence versus Texas made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's when the U.S. Supreme Court reversed itself on the previous Bowers versus Hardwick decision of 1986 and said that no, sodomy laws targeted specifically at the LGBT community were unconstitutional, and that in fact people should not be persecuted solely because of their sexual orientation. So the way I like to look at it is it took us a little over 100 years to go from being beat up and jailed for having a beer to actually having the U.S. Supreme Court recognize us as equal citizens. So while it is often frustrating at the slow pace that laws change, especially here in a place like Georgia, I do think it's important to keep it into perspective that it took, from the time of those first bars, almost 50 years for there to be culture, a little more than 50 years to get political advocacy, almost 70 years for people to stand up and say, no, we're going to have our drink and our cocktail in peace without police harassment. And then it's only taken 40 short years from that period to get to where we are today, with 6 states having full marriage equality, another half dozen having some form of civil union or domestic partnership law, to having the majority of Fortune 500 companies include sexual orientation as a protected category, and almost 50% of Fortune 500 companies recognizing gender identity as a protected category.